as the world grows quiet and the rhythm of the night settles in around you, let your thoughts drift back, not just years or decades, but to a time so turbulent, so immense in scale, that it reshaped an empire and left behind a ghost story written in blood and faith. Tonight, I invite you to close your eyes and journey with me into the heart of 19th century China, where rebellion stirred beneath the silk surface of the Qing Dynasty, a rebellion not born merely from politics or poverty, but from visions, from dreams, from a man who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, a belief that would ignite one of the most devastating civil wars the world has ever known. This is the story of the Taiping Rebellion, a conflict that claimed the lives of over 20 million people, shook the celestial throne of emperors, and left a fractured nation in its wake. Yet, it is more than just war. It is a tale of spiritual awakening and religious zeal, of hope turned to horror, of a kingdom built on prophecy and destroyed by betrayal, ambition, and pride. But don't worry, you don't need to brace for battle. This is not a tale told with haste or urgency. No, tonight, we will take our time. We will walk slowly through mist-covered hills, glide gently along the Yangtze River, and listen to the echoes of history as they whisper through ruined palaces and forgotten temples. Every name, every moment, will unfold like a soft wave on still water, one by one, gently, and with reverence. So wherever you are watching this, maybe you're nestled under the covers in Lahore, or drifting off to sleep in the quiet suburbs of Toronto, or resting your eyes as the midnight winds brush the windows of your flat in London. I'd love to know. Drop a comment below. What time is it where you are? What made you curious about this story? And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon. It helps this little corner of calming history grow, and it ensures you'll never miss another journey like this one. Now, take a deep breath. Let go of the day. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. As the dawn of the 19th century broke across the vast landscapes of China, the empire of the Qing still wore its silken robes and jade-encrusted crown with the illusion of strength. From the outside, it shimmered, a colossal realm stretching from the frozen reaches of Manchuria to the steaming jungles of the south, from the Himalayan passes to the Pacific's edge. But beneath that grandeur, the seams were splitting. The Qing Dynasty, ruled by the Manchus since the 1600s, had grown weary under the weight of centuries. Its bureaucratic machine creaked with corruption. Its armies, once fierce, now stumbled in the mud of outdated tactics, and most of all, its people, the countless millions who dwelled in rice paddies, mountain villages, and narrow, dusty lanes, were growing restless. Imagine, if you will, walking through a southern Chinese village in 1830. The air smells faintly of charcoal and drying thatch. The fields are cracked with drought, and the harvest has failed again. Your family hasn't eaten meat in weeks. Silver coins have vanished, siphoned out by foreign traders and opium dealers. And yet, tax collectors still come. Heads still bow at the portraits of long-dead emperors. Temples are empty, spirits silent. China was bleeding from within, not from the swords of enemies, but from the slow erosion of faith. Faith in the heavens, faith in the dynasty, faith in the very order of the world. For the common people, life was becoming unbearable. Natural disasters struck with frightening frequency, floods that swallowed entire counties, famines that left villages with only echoes. The once sacred mandate of heaven, the divine approval said to justify the emperor's rule, now seemed distant, perhaps even revoked. And then there was the foreign pressure. European merchants, having pried open China's ports with the sharp tip of cannon and contract, were flooding the empire with opium. The British East India Company, perched in Hong Kong, had become a shadow ruler, pumping addiction through the veins of a nation. The Qing government tried to resist. They confiscated opium. They punished traitors, but resistance only brought war. In 1839, the First Opium War began, a conflict between China and Britain over trade rights and drug policies. But it wasn't just about cargo or contracts. It was about humiliation, about the erosion of sovereignty. When the Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1842, China was forced to cede Hong Kong, open ports, and pay reparations to Britain. A public admission that the old empire was no longer master of its destiny. In every city, whispers rose. This is not the will of heaven, they said. Something had changed. Something sacred had cracked. And in the midst of this growing storm, of floods and famines, addiction and defeat, a quiet, peculiar man in Guangdong province was studying for his civil service exams. His name was Hong Xiuquan. At that time, he was only one among thousands, desperately memorizing Confucian texts, dreaming of honor and position within the great Qing bureaucracy. But Hong had already failed the exams several times. The frustration gnawed at him, and soon he would fall ill. And in that illness, Hong Xiuquan would see visions. Visions that would alter not only his life, but the fate of millions. He would rise not as a scholar, but as a prophet, not as a servant of the Qing, but as its destroyer. And so, as the dynasty strained beneath the weight of its own decay, a spark was forming far to the south, small, flickering, but unstoppable. The Taiping Rebellion was not yet born, but the world that would allow it to flourish had already come undone. And just beyond the horizon, the dreamer stirred. The village of Hua County, nestled in the southern reaches of Guangdong province, was unremarkable by most standards. It was a place of rice paddies and modest dwellings, crisscrossed by narrow footpaths, and lined with stubborn crops that bent with every seasonal hardship. Chickens clucked through dusty courtyards, children ran barefoot over earthen roads, and the scent of wood smoke hung permanently in the air. It was here, on January 1st, 1814, that Hong Xiuquan was born into a Hakka family, a minority ethnic group known for its wandering roots and hard-earned resilience. His family was poor, but not destitute. They lived modestly, placing their hopes in the promise of education. The one pathway, however narrow, that led from mud-floor homes to the marble halls of imperial service. From an early age, Hong showed signs of brilliance. He absorbed texts like sunlight on river water, and his family nurtured in him the dream of becoming a scholar official, a civil servant of the Qing Empire, selected through the grueling and ancient imperial examination system. These exams were no ordinary tests. They were marathons of memory, requiring a man to know Confucian classics line by line, word for word, with the precision of scripture. To pass these exams was to escape poverty, to earn a title, a robe, a salary. It was to bring honor to one's family for generations. And so, like tens of thousands of others, Hong studied, day and night, year after year, memorizing, reciting, bowing to the great philosophers of China's golden past. But Hong's path was not destined to be smooth. In 1827, at just 13 years old, he passed the local preliminary exams, an encouraging sign. Yet when he advanced to the provincial level in the city of Canton, the path grew steeper. The standards were brutal, the competition relentless, and he failed. He tried again, and failed again, and then again, 4 times in all, over several painful years. Each failure was more than a disappointment. It was a crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed in. For in Confucian society, the exam system was not just a measure of intelligence. It was a moral judgment. To fail meant, in the eyes of many, that heaven had withheld its favor. The shame settled deep in his bones, but something else stirred. In 1837, after another failed attempt, Hong fell gravely ill, whether from exhaustion, despair, or a fevered infection. We do not know. What we do know is this: while he lay unconscious in his home, something extraordinary happened. He dreamed, but not the dreams of the ordinary mind. These were visions, vivid, divine, and terrifying. In his dream, Hong was carried into the heavens. There, he saw a radiant old man with a golden beard, dressed in imperial robes. This figure, he would later claim, was God the Father. He also met a younger, noble figure, a brother, a protector, who would later be revealed as Jesus Christ. In this vision, Hong was told that the world was filled with demons, corrupting mankind, and that he had been chosen to purify the earth. He was given a sword, a heavenly seal, and a divine mandate. But here's where the story bends like smoke in moonlight, because Hong did not understand these visions at first. He woke confused, troubled, moved, but without clarity. The meaning would not come until 6 years later. In 1843, a chance encounter would unlock it all. While staying with a distant relative, Hong was given a set of Christian tracts written by a Chinese Protestant convert. They were basic teachings of Christianity, stories of creation, sin, redemption, and Jesus, the Son of God. As Hong read them, something inside him cracked open like a dam. He saw the visions again, but now with names, meaning, and urgency. He was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He had been called to overthrow the demons of the world. The old man in the dream, God, the noble figure, Jesus, the corruption he was meant to fight. The Qing Dynasty itself, everything changed. Hong abandoned the Confucian path. He burned his idols. He tore apart ancestral tablets. He renounced the imperial system and began preaching a new truth, one unlike anything China had seen before. He called it the worship of Shangdi, the Heavenly Father, a blend of Christian theology and Chinese cosmology, twisted through the lens of personal revelation. And people listened. At first, it was a handful. Family, friends, curious neighbors. But word spread. His teachings were radical, yes, but they were also hopeful. They promised equality, a new age, a kingdom where the poor would be uplifted, the corrupt cast down, and heaven would reign on earth. And Hong believed every word. He was no longer a failed scholar. He was a prophet, a leader, a man with a sword in his hand and a divine kingdom in his eyes. By 1844, the winds in the south of China had begun to shift. What had once been the quiet murmurs of a failed scholar were now taking on the cadence of prophecy. Hong Xiuquan, once anonymous among thousands of test takers, now walked with a new fire in his chest, not the fire of ambition, but of purpose, of destiny. He had found his truth, and it was monumental. He was, in his eyes, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, a chosen vessel through whom God would cleanse the world. He began to see the Qing Dynasty not simply as corrupt rulers, but as demonic agents, servants of Satan, propping up idolatry, injustice, and the oppression of God's children. This idea, it was radical. It was revolution wrapped in revelation. But let's slow down for a moment. To understand the impact of Hong's vision, we need to understand how it diverged from the world around him. Traditional Chinese belief systems, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, were about harmony, hierarchy, and balance. They emphasized order, family, the cycle of life, and reverence for ancestors. They didn't preach a jealous, singular God. They didn't speak of heaven as a kingdom to be brought down with sword and fire. But Hong did. His theology, formed in the heat of personal vision and patchwork Protestant texts, was a strange alchemy, a Christian God, but Chinese in dress and tone, Jesus as Savior, but also as sibling. Heaven not as a reward in the afterlife, but as something to build on earth, here and now, under his guidance. He taught that God had sent him to restore righteousness, to tear down false idols, to cleanse China of evil, including Confucian temples, Buddhist shrines, and all traces of emperor worship. The message was simple. The world is broken, but God has chosen us to fix it. And people listened. In the mountains of Guangxi province, a rugged, often overlooked region of hills and deep forests, Hong's teachings began to spread like river mist at dawn. He was joined by other believers, many of them Hakka like himself. Among them were men of conviction and charisma, most notably Feng Yunshan, a key organizer, and Yang Xiuqing, a mystic who would later claim the Holy Spirit spoke through him directly. They formed the God-worshipping society, a semi-secret religious movement dedicated to spiritual purity and radical social reform. It was more than a church. It was a brotherhood, a fellowship, a seed of something far larger. The society preached the worship of one true God, Shangdi, the destruction of idols and temples, the abolishment of social hierarchy and corruption, gender equality in worship, a striking notion for the time, and eventually the mandate to overthrow the Qing Dynasty. Now, at first, this may seem like a spiritual rebellion alone, an inward revolution. But remember, belief is never neutral in a time of suffering. For the peasants and laborers of southern China, Hong's message came not as a curiosity, but as a lifeline. It promised them more than just salvation. It promised them dignity. He told them they were God's children, equally loved, destined not for slavery and suffering, but for holiness and justice. In a world where the average peasant's fate was dictated by a distant emperor and a broken bureaucracy, this was thunder in the silence. The gatherings grew. Converts arrived from villages near and far. Some came with curiosity, others with desperation. Many brought their entire families, their meager possessions, and their hopes. Hong and his lieutenants established strict moral codes for their followers. No opium, no gambling, no foot binding, no adultery. The community functioned almost like an early theocracy. Those who joined gave up their old allegiances. They were no longer Qing subjects. They were now citizens of the heavenly kingdom. This, of course, began to worry local officials. The Qing government, though slow to react at first, soon realized that the God-worshipping society was not merely a fringe cult. It was a growing army of believers, many of them armed, disciplined, and spiritually galvanized. And as tension built, violence was inevitable. In 1850, after skirmishes with Qing forces, the movement openly declared war against the imperial state. The followers of Hong Xiuquan no longer hid. They marched in columns, bearing banners that read, "Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace," the Taiping Rebellion. This was the moment the spiritual movement became a revolution. And what had begun as one man's fevered dream was now a living fire, fanned by injustice, lit by faith, and poised to consume a dynasty. The year was 1850. In the thick, humid air of Guangxi province, clouds rolled across the sky like messengers of something ancient and inevitable. The hills had grown restless. Villages whispered. Soldiers marched, and in the small town of Jinshan, something stirred that would shake the empire to its core. The Taiping Rebellion, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, was no longer a secret society. It had emerged, fully formed and unashamed, from the shadows, and it carried with it a promise, or perhaps a prophecy, that the world as it was would not last. Let's pause for a moment to feel the texture of that moment. Imagine yourself standing in a rice field outside Jinshan. You hear drums, wooden spears clattering, barefoot peasants gathering with ragged banners painted in bold, black characters. Their eyes glow not with fear, but with fervor. They are not soldiers by birth. They are farmers, miners, laborers, the forgotten people of the empire. But now they stand shoulder to shoulder, held together by a single belief, that they are chosen by heaven to reclaim the world. This is what Hong Xiuquan had created, not just a rebellion, but a new worldview. His movement was not only military, but also deeply psychological. He had given the poor something the Qing could not, a reason to fight. By the start of 1851, the movement had grown from scattered converts to a formidable army. Men and women alike joined, swearing oaths of purity and loyalty to the Heavenly Father, vowing to rid China of demons, meaning, in their theology, the Qing Dynasty and all who supported it. On January 11, 1851, Hong Xiuquan made his most audacious declaration yet. On the banks of a quiet stream in Jinshan, he proclaimed the founding of a new state, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. He would rule not as emperor, but as Tian Wang, the Heavenly King. And with that, the rebellion was no longer metaphorical. It had a capital, a crown, an army. The war had begun. Across the Jinshan, uprising, their first true engagement, came quickly. The Qing government, alarmed by the sudden consolidation of rebel forces in Guangxi, dispatched troops to crush the movement. They expected a rout. They thought this was a disorganized band of heretics and peasants. They were wrong. The Battle of Jinshan, fought in February 1851, was the first shock to the Qing war machine. Though poorly armed, many rebels carried homemade weapons and wore cloth armor. They fought with stunning coordination and passion. They sang hymns in battle. They quoted scripture, and they held their ground. With every victory, more followers arrived. Not just Hakka villagers, but disillusioned Han Chinese, former bandits, poor soldiers, people from every province who saw in the Taiping not just a rebellion, but a revelation. Hong Xiuquan's charisma was bolstered by his inner circle. Each man carefully selected, each one assigned a divine title. The Eastern King, the Western King, the Northern King, and so on. They became apostles of revolution, organizing regiments, drafting laws, and translating religious doctrine into daily life. The movement had a clear, almost prophetic structure. Women were allowed to serve in the army in separate units, but equal in purpose. Men and women lived apart, even husbands and wives, in accordance with Hong's doctrine of purity. Property was pooled and redistributed. Gambling, alcohol, tobacco, and opium were banned. Education was prioritized. Literacy became sacred. It was a strange, strict world, a theocracy on the march. And yet, it worked. In late 1851 and through 1852, the Taiping army grew in both number and ambition. They swept through towns and cities across southern China, leaving stunned Qing garrisons in their wake. Wherever they went, they burned temples and destroyed idols, smashing the symbols of old China. They renamed places, baptized converts, and proclaimed the glory of the heavenly kingdom. Some welcomed them. Many resisted, and as the rebellion moved northward, the violence escalated. Entire towns were emptied, either through massacre or migration. Food stores were seized. Qing officials were executed or exiled. And always, the Taiping message remained the same. This is not our doing. This is heaven's will. The demons must be cast down. Water waved the march to the Yangtze. By 1852, the Taiping army had become a rolling tide, an unstoppable force pushing northward toward the very heart of the Qing Dynasty. Their eyes turned toward the Yangtze River, China's great artery, and beyond it, the wealthy city of Nanjing. To reach it, they would have to cross rivers, scale mountains, and endure constant attack from imperial forces. But still, they moved. By early 1853, after a series of decisive victories, the Taiping crossed the Yangtze and approached Nanjing, the ancient southern capital, the southern Golden Gate. It was heavily fortified, filled with loyal Qing troops, and vital to the empire's stability. And yet, it would fall. But that part of the story, like a lantern flickering at the end of a long corridor, waits just ahead. The year was 1853, and the skies over central China were thick with the ash of burning towns. The winter air carried the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and something far older, the scent of reckoning. The Taiping army, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, surged forward like a rising tide. These were not seasoned warriors in gleaming armor. No, they were a strange mix of farmers and preachers, visionaries and villagers, dressed in simple tunics, heads wrapped in white cloth to symbolize purity and righteousness. They carried pikes, swords, and matchlock muskets, a chaotic armament, but their greatest weapon was conviction. Conviction that they were doing heaven's work. Their hymns rang out across the countryside, echoing through bamboo groves and muddy riverbanks. They sang praises to the Heavenly Father. They recited verses from tracts and memorized proclamations written by Hong Xiuquan himself. And they moved forward, always forward, toward Nanjing, the jewel of the South. But to understand the weight of their march, we must understand why Nanjing mattered. Nanjing, the southern heart Nanjing, was more than a city. It was a symbol. It had once been the capital of the Ming Dynasty, a throne of emperors and scholars, nestled along the Yangtze River like a pearl in the mud. Its stone walls stretched for miles, among the longest city walls in the world, protecting elegant palaces, bustling markets, and ancient temples. It was a city of learning and wealth, a heart of Chinese civilization. For the Qing, it was a vital stronghold. For the Taiping, it was destiny. To capture Nanjing was to proclaim legitimacy. To take it was to place a crown upon their kingdom. But the road to Nanjing was soaked in blood, the road of fire. As the Taiping advanced, they met fierce resistance. Qing forces, now realizing the threat they faced, threw everything they had to stop the rebels. Cities became battlegrounds. Villages became tombs. Civilians were often caught in between, some siding with the rebels, others slaughtered for doing so. In each battle, the Taiping proved one terrible truth. Faith can outlast fear. They won victory after victory, sometimes through clever tactics, but often through sheer endurance. They were willing to fight to the death. They believed death would bring them closer to heaven, that martyrdom in service of God was honorable. By early 1853, after capturing the city of Wuchang, they reached Yangzhou, just north of the Yangtze River. From there, they launched their final approach toward Nanjing. The Qing defenders within Nanjing braced for the worst. They had heard the stories of temples razed, officials executed, entire city populations forced to convert or die. The Taiping army was not simply an invading force. It was a storm of belief, and it was coming. Crossed the siege of Nanjing in March 1853, the Taiping forces encircled Nanjing. The siege was brutal. For weeks, the rebels dug trenches and tunneled under the city walls. Artillery bombarded the ramparts. Skirmishes flared at the gates. The Qing defenders, though outnumbered, fought with desperation. They knew what capture would mean, and yet it was not enough. After intense fighting, on March 19, 1853, the walls of Nanjing were breached. The Taiping poured in. What followed was a moment of ecstasy and terror. Qing officials were executed in public squares. Those loyal to the empire were purged. Temples were burned. Idols were smashed. But at the same time, the heavenly kingdom was proclaimed with glory. Hong Xiuquan entered the city not as a general, but as a king, the heavenly king. He declared Nanjing the new capital of the Taiping heavenly kingdom and renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. Of a new kingdom is born inside the walls of Tianjin. The Taiping began to build their vision. Government ministries were established. Streets were renamed. Laws were drafted. Palaces were adorned not with imperial dragons, but with verses from Hong's writings. Gender segregation was enforced strictly. The 10 heavenly commandments were imposed with the weight of divine law. It was a strange mixture of order and zeal, of discipline and dogma. At first, there was hope. The people, weary of Qing corruption and bandit raids, welcomed the promise of a new era. Grain was distributed. Schools reopened. Opium was banned. A moral regime took root. But beneath this order, cracks were already forming. The leaders of the rebellion, the so-called kings, began to clash. Power struggles brewed like storm clouds behind palace doors. Hong Xiuquan, the Eastern king, began to claim divine possession more frequently, sometimes contradicting Hong himself. The seeds of inner decay were being planted even as the kingdom bloomed. Still, for now, the heavenly kingdom stood tall. And across China, word spread like wildfire. A new dynasty had taken root. The Qing had been humiliated. The emperor in Beijing was silent. But silence can be deceiving. And far in the north, a quiet countermovement was gathering. Not of visions, but of discipline. Not of dreams, but of vengeance. The Taiping had seized a capital, but they had also awakened an empire. When the Taiping forces first captured Nanjing in 1853 and renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital, there was a strange stillness in the air. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of something waiting to happen. The city had endured a brutal siege. Fires still smoldered in its outer districts. Bodies were buried hastily in mass graves, while red banners fluttered overhead, bearing proclamations of divine victory. And yet, in those early months, something like hope took root. Hong Xiuquan moved into the former Qing governor's residence, which he transformed into a heavenly palace. It was richly adorned with religious inscriptions, ceremonial arches, and large gates that only he, the heavenly king, could pass through. His followers built him golden thrones and ornate sleeping chambers. He was no longer simply a prophet. He was, in every sense, a monarch anointed by heaven. From Tianjin, the Taiping rulers began to shape their society into the image Hong had long envisioned. Scroll the laws of heaven, the Taiping administration imposed a strict set of rules known as the heavenly laws. These laws were enforced with absolute seriousness and were believed to be divinely mandated. Men and women were required to live separately, even if they were married. Foot binding, long practiced in traditional Chinese culture, was banned as immoral. Opium use and tobacco smoking were outlawed. Gambling, prostitution, theft, and adultery were punishable by death. Property was communal. All personal wealth was to be surrendered to the state. The city was divided into strict units, groups of 25 families, each under the command of an officer who ensured complete compliance. Religious ceremonies were held regularly. Hymns were sung in the streets. Public executions of those who broke the laws were common and always framed as necessary purifications. It was, in a way, a holy order, but it was also a gilded cage. Many citizens began to feel the weight of constant surveillance, the pressure of moral perfection, the fear of being labeled impure. Life in the heavenly capital was not one of ease or joy. It was a life of scrutiny, and at the center of it all was Hong Xiuquan. Crowned the hidden king, as the rebellion grew, Hong became increasingly withdrawn. he rarely appeared in public. He surrounded himself with guards and concubines, despite his earlier proclamations about purity and celibacy, and communicated with his subjects through written edicts and messengers. He claimed to be in direct communion with God, and only his word could alter doctrine. His authority became unchallengeable. Yet, the real power of daily governance fell to his lieutenants, the kings he had appointed earlier in the movement. Chief among them was Hong Xiuquan, the Eastern king. Speaking Hong Xiuquan, voice of the Holy Spirit Yang, was a former charcoal seller with no formal education. But within the Taiping ranks, he claimed to be the mouthpiece of the Holy Spirit, quite literally. During trances, he would speak with a booming voice and claim that God was using him as a vessel. And Hong allowed it. In these divine episodes, Yang issued commands, settled disputes, and directed military campaigns, all under the claim of spiritual possession. He became the most powerful man in Tianjin, second only to Hong himself. But as Yang's power grew, so did his arrogance. He began making decisions without consulting Hong. He built a palace that rivaled the heavenly kings. He referred to himself as Lord of 10,000 years, a title traditionally reserved for emperors. He punished other kings harshly, sometimes cruelly, and began accumulating spies and personal guards. The heavenly kingdom, which had once stood united in holy cause, now cracked from within. The Tianjin incident by 1856, tensions reached a boiling point. Hong Xiuquan demanded to be given a title equal to the heavenly king. He even insinuated that Hong Xiuquan should step aside or be punished for doubting the will of heaven as spoken through Yang. It was a dangerous move. In the dark corridors of the palace, Hong plotted in secret with his remaining loyal kings. On a quiet night in September 1856, under the cloak of ritual and shadow, Hong ordered a sudden purge. Hong Xiuquan was lured into the palace, disarmed, and beheaded on the spot. But the violence didn't stop there. For the next 3 days, Tianjin became a city of slaughter. Thousands of Yang's followers, soldiers, officers, even his family, were dragged from their homes and executed in public squares. The blood ran through the streets of the heavenly capital. This massacre would later be known as the Tianjin incident. It was the moment the dream fractured. From then on, fear gripped the palace. The surviving kings distrusted one another. Hong, increasingly isolated, began relying more on personal guards and divine proclamations. The momentum that had once surged like a wave across China began to falter. The Taiping army, though still vast, now suffered from internal doubt. Officers questioned the chain of command. Soldiers grew weary of the puritanical laws. Civilians, once hopeful, now whispered of hypocrisy. And beyond the city walls, the Qing were rebuilding. Cloud the rain begins in the north. Qing generals such as Zheng Guofan were training new armies, disciplined, regional forces loyal not to the throne in Beijing, but to their Confucian ideals and personal honor. These would become the backbone of the resistance, and the Western world was watching. British and French interests, once unsure of which side to support, now saw in the Taiping a threat not just to Qing power, but to trade, to stability, to their expanding empire. The days of Taiping triumph were ending. The heavenly kingdom had taken the throne, but now sat upon it alone, bleeding and surrounded. By the late 1850s, Tianjin was no longer simply a military stronghold. It had evolved into a sprawling court of divine bureaucracy. It was a world unlike any other in 19th century China. The air inside the city was dense with incense and proclamation. Messengers darted between official halls. Courtiers adorned in silk robes stitched with heavenly symbols moved with purpose, but bowed often. The rhythm of life pulsed according to prayer, regulation, and ritual. This was the court of the heavenly kingdom, where every decision, no matter how small, was said to echo the will of God. But within this heavenly order, contradictions multiplied, scroll heavenly protocols, and earthly struggles every morning. Taiping officials rose with the sun to gather at administrative chambers carved from the bones of old Qing government buildings. Daily devotions were recited before any civil matters were addressed. The hierarchy was elaborate. At the top sat Hong Xiuquan, whose presence was often felt more than seen. Beneath him were the remaining kings, the northern, southern, western, and assistant kings, many of whom now ruled with trembling hands after the bloody purge of Yang Xiuqing. Then came the civil administrators, known as heavenly officials, responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, and ensuring ideological purity among the people. This system, in theory, was one of equality and divine justice. But in practice, it reflected all the flaws of fallen empires before it. Corruption seeped through its layers like ink in silk. Bribes were quietly passed despite threats of death. Petty rivalries flared between departments. And most of all, a dangerous obsession with moral policing began to consume the bureaucracy. In Tianjin, you could be executed not for theft or rebellion, but for dancing, laughing too loudly, or failing to memorize holy hymns. White women in the heavenly kingdom. One of the most radical features of the Taiping regime was its vision of gender equality, at least on the surface. For the first time in Chinese imperial history, women could serve as officials and army officers. Female battalions marched through Tianjin in neat formations, heads high, swords drawn. They were seen as warriors in God's army, no less righteous than their male counterparts. Foot binding, a symbol of elite femininity in Qing China, was abolished. Marriage was no longer based on social standing or family arrangement, but on mutual devotion to the cause. It sounded revolutionary, and in many ways it was. But this equality, like much of the Taiping ideology, existed mostly in slogan. In practice, the lives of women were still heavily restricted. Women and men were segregated in all public and private spaces. Relationships required approval from superiors. Women's military roles, while symbolic, rarely included frontline command. Even Hong Xiuquan himself, who had dozens of concubines housed secretly within the palace, enforced strict chastity on his followers. The contradiction was evident, and people whispered about it behind closed doors. Still, compared to the rigid patriarchy of the Qing Dynasty, the Taiping vision shimmered with idealism, even if it often failed in execution. Crystal ball, religious theater, and celestial dreams, the court of Tianjin was more than a place of governance. It was a stage of divine performance. Every week, elaborate rituals were held in vast assembly halls. Taiping officials wore flowing white robes and sang sacred hymns, often rewritten Christian verses in rhythmic cadence. Statues of the Heavenly Father were displayed behind drapes, and incense filled the room as if to summon the divine. Hong Xiuquan rarely appeared in person. Instead, he sent edicts adorned with golden seals and calligraphy. These documents were read aloud in booming voices by chosen scribes, as courtiers prostrated themselves on the floor. It was not politics, it was liturgy. The lines between state and church blurred entirely. Every policy decision was framed as a divine command. Every military campaign was a holy crusade. Every punishment was a spiritual cleansing. And yet, there was always a lingering sense that the heavens were drifting further and further away, a paradise in decay. The longer the Taiping court endured, the more it began to mirror the imperial traditions it once condemned. Hong Xiuquan, who once claimed humility, now lived in unreachable seclusion. He dined on golden dishes, wore garments sewn with celestial dragons, and required all who entered his presence to kneel and avert their gaze. Officials who rose through merit in the early days of the rebellion were now replaced by loyalists and family members. Nepotism reigned. Disloyalty, or even mild criticism, was met with torture or exile. The public hymns lost their passion. The street sermons became routine. The people, weary of years of war and famine, began to lose faith in the heavenly kingdom. Even nature seemed to resist their reign. Floods hit the Yangtze Basin. Locusts devoured crops in nearby provinces. The once flourishing communes around Tianjin faced starvation, and the enemy, the Qing, the foreigners, the mercenaries, was drawing nearer. Compass, a court cut off from the world diplomatically, the Taiping court remained isolated and misunderstood. Envoys from Britain and France visited Tianjin, hoping to assess whether these rebels could be partners in weakening the Qing. What they found shocked them. Instead of enlightened reformers, they encountered religious zealots, unable or unwilling to engage in diplomacy. The Taiping leaders refused to make concessions on trade or recognize foreign hierarchy. They saw themselves not as equals, but as the sole voice of God on earth. The British, who had considered siding with the Taiping, withdrew their support. Soon after, they reaffirmed their alliance with the Qing. This was a turning point. The Taiping, once a tidal wave of revolution, had become a kingdom besieged on all fronts, spiritually isolated, militarily stagnant, and politically blind. And as the court continued to look inward, reciting prayers and dreaming of heaven, the forces of earth, cannons, bayonets, armies, crept ever closer. By the early 1860s, as the Taiping Rebellion thundered into its second decade, the world beyond China's borders had begun to take a keen interest in this strange uprising. From the foggy docks of London to the salons of Paris, the rebellion was discussed not just as a Chinese civil war, but as a possible reshaping of Asia itself. To the foreign powers, especially Britain and France, the key question was this: should the heavenly kingdom be crushed or embraced? Black Flag, the British dilemma. Great Britain, the most powerful empire of the era, had already fought 2 opium wars against the Qing Dynasty. Its merchants, missionaries, and military advisors were spread across China's coast, peering inland with suspicion and ambition. At first, the British were unsure of the Taiping. The rebels seemed to hate the Qing, which aligned with British interests, and they professed a kind of Christianity, or something that resembled it. British observers wondered, could this be a new Christian China rising from the ruins of the old? To answer this, they sent envoys to Tianjin. What they encountered, however, unnerved them deeply. Taiping officials spoke in mystical riddles. They sang rewritten hymns and recited proclamations from Hong Xiuquan, whom they referred to not as king, but as the heavenly younger brother of Jesus. The British saw no order, no diplomacy, no logic, only a theocracy drunk on its own revelations. Trade routes were closed. Treaties were dismissed. Offers of cooperation were met with holy lectures. The British had seen revolutions before, but this was something altogether alien. They withdrew quietly and made their decision. The Taiping could not be allies. French suspicion and missionary outrage. France, too, was watching closely, particularly its network of Catholic missionaries in China. To them, the Taiping were not fellow believers. They were heretics, dangerous imitators of the faith, twisting scripture into a weapon of war. Reports trickled back to Paris of churches being burned, priests executed, and villagers forced to abandon Catholicism in favor of Taiping doctrine. The French were outraged. Unlike the British, whose interest lay in commerce, the French saw the Taiping as spiritual threats. They offered quiet but firm support to the Qing, hoping to restore order and protect their missionaries. The idea of a pseudo-Christian empire, led by a self-proclaimed Messiah, horrified the Vatican and Paris alike. Globe showing Asia, Australia, American mercenaries and adventurers. And then there were the Americans. Some came out of curiosity. Others came for money. and a few came with muskets slung over their backs, looking to carve a name for themselves in the chaos. The most infamous of these was Frederick Townsend Ward, a bold and reckless American who would go on to form and lead the ever-victorious army, a modernized Qing loyalist force trained in Western tactics. Ward wasn't interested in theology. He didn't care about empires or doctrines. He was a soldier of fortune, and he saw in the Taiping Rebellion not a cause, but a market for warfare. His efforts, along with those of later leaders like Charles Chinese, Gordon of Britain, would tip the balance in favor of the Qing in years to come. And yet, even as foreign powers chose sides, none fully grasped the complexity of the rebellion. To them, it was just another Eastern war. But to those living within it, it was a fight between heaven and earth. Crossed the foreign support for the Qing as international interest sharpened, foreign support began flowing not to the rebels, but to their enemies. British gunboats patrolled key rivers, guarding Qing-held trade centers. French engineers helped fortify strategic cities like Shanghai. Western-trained armies, like the ever-victorious army, launched devastating campaigns against Taiping forces. The Qing, though weakened, now had foreign steel, training, and strategy on their side. And the Taiping, they were still praying to heaven. The foreign powers had made a cold calculation. However corrupt or stagnant the Qing might be, they were predictable. And predictability was good for business. The Taiping were not. The world watches. The war deepens. Newspapers across the Western world ran wild and contradictory headlines. Chinese prophet marches on the coast. The second Christ in Asia. Savages threaten civilization. These stories were half-truths at best, exaggerations at worst. But they captured a deep anxiety. What if China really changed? What if the Qing fell and were replaced by an unpredictable theocracy? What would happen to trade, diplomacy, and colonial footholds? And so, behind closed doors, foreign ministers and merchants agreed. The Taiping must be stopped. Their strange religion, their closed ports, their refusal to engage with modern diplomacy. These were not signs of progress, but of instability. The heavenly kingdom, once seen as a possible partner, was now a global threat to be extinguished. Wilted flower hope narrows like a window back in Tianjin. The Taiping leaders sensed the shift. They saw British ships aiding their enemies. They heard of American mercenaries training Qing troops. They read foreign papers condemning them as zealots and lunatics. And still, they insisted, "We are the chosen. We are the flame. We are the kingdom foretold." But fewer people believed them now. Inside the walls, food ran low. Confidence cracked. Desertions increased. The court turned inward, more rigid, more fearful. They no longer sought recognition. They sought survival. The tide had turned, and the heavenly kingdom now stood alone. By the year 1862, the once glorious Taiping capital, Tianjin, formerly known as Nanjing, had become a city trembling under the weight of its own prophecy. What was once a shining beacon of rebellion, hope, and divine rule was now encircled, not only by Qing armies, but by time, by hunger, and by the slow crumbling of belief. Inside the walls, the heavenly kingdom was beginning to fade. Cloud a city under siege, Nanjing, resting along the banks of the mighty Yangtze River, had long been a fortress of power in southern China. But now its gates were shut, its people whispered with unease. The enemy was not just outside the walls, it was also within. The Qing, with new weapons and strategies learned from foreign advisors, began tightening the noose. Surrounding cities and supply lines were cut off, farms burned, canals blockaded, roads vanished into smoke and ruin. And so, the siege began not with a thunderous assault, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a dying city. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. By winter's chill, Nanjing was a city starving for salvation. Desperation in the heavenly capital within the Taiping court, the mood had soured. The divine proclamations were still shouted from balconies, but the crowds had thinned. Food rations shrank to near nothing. Disease spread like a whisper. Once lavish palaces, once filled with gold and hymns, now echoed with footsteps of the hungry. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king himself, had become more withdrawn. He no longer addressed his people directly. He retreated to his inner chambers, surrounding himself with a shrinking circle of loyalists and pages of divine writings. Some claimed he was receiving new visions, fresh messages from heaven. Others whispered that he had gone mad, haunted by the faces of the dead, the blood of the millions. Whether prophet or prisoner of his own belief, Hong began to issue increasingly erratic commands. He ordered the planting of vegetables in palace courtyards, desperate efforts to grow food where none could. He dismissed generals, promoted eunuchs, and handed out pamphlets rather than weapons. The heavenly king no longer fought the war with soldiers. He fought it with scripture. Crossed internal collapse, betrayal and paranoia, as faith waned, so too did loyalty. In the outer districts of Nanjing, hungry soldiers sold their weapons for rice. Guards abandoned their posts. Entire regiments slipped away under the cover of darkness, vanishing into the hills or defecting to the Qing. One of the Taiping's most capable generals, Li Zicheng, begged for military reforms. He saw the cracks widening. He saw the Qing pressing closer. But his warnings were often ignored. Hong Xiuquan's paranoia had grown. He trusted no one fully, not even his own commanders. Several officials were accused of treason without proof and quietly executed. What began as a movement of heavenly brotherhood had turned into a regime of suspicion. Fire the Qing advance. Step by step outside the city walls, Zheng Guofen, the disciplined and determined Qing general, directed the campaign with relentless focus. Zheng was no flashy warlord. He was a Confucian scholar, methodical, patient, and utterly committed to restoring Qing rule. His strategy was simple: starve the city, then burn it. He knew that the Taiping had no more allies, that their foreign hopes had withered, that they were isolated, both spiritually and politically. And so he pressed on. Towns fell like dominoes. Bridges were blown apart. Rice fields were salted and razed. He did not march on Nanjing with haste. He circled, watched, and waited until the capital was suffocating. Crescent moon, a silent night in a dying kingdom, as spring of 1864 crept in. Something unthinkable happened. Inside his chamber, Hong Xiuquan quietly died. Some said it was illness. Others whispered suicide. A few claimed it was divine ascension, that he had simply vanished. In truth, he had likely starved to death, refusing food in the final days, sustained only by his own scriptures. His son, a child of just 14 years old, was named the new heavenly king. But the people no longer believed. There were no hymns in the streets, no cheers, no divine proclamations, only the sound of footsteps on stone and the low groans of the sick and the starving. The city's fire, once so fierce, had flickered into ember. The walls tremble, and then, on July 19th, 1864, the silence shattered. The Qing breached the walls. They had tunneled beneath the defenses and placed explosive charges. With a deafening roar, a section of Nanjing's ancient wall crumbled into dust. Thousands of Qing soldiers poured into the city like a flood. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Taiping soldiers fought bravely, some with makeshift weapons, others with bare hands. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. For days, the city burned. Smoke choked the sky, blood soaked the stones. There was no mercy for man, woman, or child. By week's end, the heavenly kingdom had fallen. Cloud aftermath, ashes of a dream when Zheng Guofan finally entered the shattered palace. He found no throne of gold, no heavenly relics, only ashes, crumbled books, and a ruined city. What began as a vision of paradise had ended in hellfire. The Taiping dream, strange, divine, and impossible, had crumbled with its walls. And yet, something lingered in the ruins, a question that no general, no emperor, no historian could ever truly answer. Had they almost changed China? Had heaven itself nearly touched the earth? When the smoke finally lifted over Nanjing, and the last cries of battle faded into the humid air, China was left not with a triumph, but with a wound. The Taiping Rebellion, once ablaze with heavenly fire and revolutionary promise, had ended in ruin. But history rarely ends so cleanly. Beneath the ashes, there were questions, echoes, scars that would shape the Chinese psyche for generations to come. This was not just the collapse of a rebellion. It was the shattering of a dream and the beginning of a long reckoning, a cost beyond counting by the time the rebellion was finally extinguished in 1864. The cost had become almost impossible to measure. Over 20 million lives were lost. a number so vast it stretches the imagination. Entire provinces were depopulated. Fields once golden with rice now lay blackened and abandoned. Cities were nothing but broken walls and mass graves. The Yangtze River, which had once carried trade and poetry between China's great southern cities, now bore the stench of war and the silent burden of floating corpses. This wasn't simply a civil war. It was a national trauma, one so devastating that it reshaped the map, the population, and the psychology of the Qing Dynasty itself. Even for those who survived, life would never be the same. Farmers returned to find homes gone. Children grew up with no memory of peace. And the Qing, victorious though they were, ruled over a broken land. Magnifying glass tilted left a dream misunderstood. And yet, in the silence that followed, many began to ask, what had the Taiping really been fighting for? Were they madmen led by a deluded prophet? Or visionaries, centuries ahead of their time? Hong Xiuquan had spoken of equality, of land for all, of ending corruption, and raising the lowly. His words, twisted though they became, held something that resonated. Even after his death, some peasants in southern China continued to pray quietly for the return of the heavenly kingdom. The idea had not fully died. It had simply gone underground. There is something deeply human in that, the clinging to hope, even when the world collapses around you. Open book, the Qing's hollow victory. The Qing Dynasty may have regained control, but it emerged from the rebellion shattered and vulnerable. Zheng Guofan, the very man who crushed the Taiping, once remarked privately that though the rebellion had ended, the rot within the Qing court remained. The emperor had not saved the dynasty, the generals had, and that imbalance would haunt the Qing for the rest of its short life. The very tools used to put down the rebellion, like regional armies raised by local leaders, would soon become fractious war machines of their own. It was as if, in defeating one rebellion, the seeds of a dozen others had been sown. Thought balloons seeds of future revolutions, though the Taiping were gone. The ideas they awakened would echo again and again in Chinese history. When the Boxer Rebellion rose decades later, the memory of Taiping zealotry was still alive. When Sun Yat-sen led the Republican Revolution in the early 1900s, he drew inspiration from land reform, anti-Manchu sentiment, and righteous rebellion. Echoes of Taiping ideology. Even Mao Zedong, a century later, would study the Taiping with fascination, admiring their rural roots and mass mobilization. Hong Xiuquan may have failed, but his flame lit a long fuse. His movement had introduced the possibility that emperors could fall, that heaven could speak through a commoner, that the divine might side with the poor. Dove the people remember in the small villages of Guangxi and Jiangxi, where the rebellion had once begun. Folk songs were still sung in secret. Some told of Hong's visions, of a man who saw angels and dared to challenge dragons. Others mourned the cities lost, the children taken, the hope that bled out on the battlefield. To the historians in Beijing, the Taiping were dangerous heretics. But to the people who had lived and died in their wake, they were something more complex. They were ghosts, yes, but also symbols of change, of justice denied, of dreams too large for the world that held them. Monuments and memory today in modern Nanjing. A quiet memorial marks the rebellion's final stand. Visitors pass through stone archways, read names etched into marble, and listen to museum guides explain the events like fading legends. But the story isn't fully gone. Walk along the Yangtze at dusk, and you can almost feel it, that weight in the air. The sense that something vast once unfolded here, that a city dreamed of heaven and almost believed it could reach it. It's in the way the river glimmers, the silence between temple bells, the old men playing chess in courtyards where palaces once stood. The Taiping may have fallen, but history, like memory, does not forget so easily. When history remembers Zheng Guofan, it does so with both reverence and unease. He was not a man of fire, like Hong Xiuquan, no prophet, no revolutionary. He was a Confucian scholar, a bureaucrat by training, a man of slow, deliberate thoughts and firm moral grounding. And yet, it was this man, quiet, composed, who brought the heavenly kingdom crashing down in rivers of blood. How did such a man rise to power? And how did he live with the cost of the victory he had won? Let's walk beside him now, through dusty halls of study, across ruined cities, and into the conflicted heart of a man burdened by destiny. Scroll scholar first, general later, Zheng Guofan was not born to be a warrior. In the early 1800s, he was raised in Hunan province in a family that valued classical learning and Confucian virtue above all else. From a young age, he was immersed in the ancient texts, the Analects, the Book of Rites, absorbing the deep codes of loyalty, hierarchy, and moral discipline. He passed the imperial examinations with distinction, earning entry into the elite civil service, the very machinery that sustained the Qing. But when rebellion swept across the south, and the imperial army failed to hold the line, it was to men like Zheng that the court turned, not soldiers, but thinkers, loyalists, men whose belief in order was unshakable. And so, reluctantly, Zheng Guofan became something he never sought to be, a commander of war. Crossed building the Xiang army. Zheng's strategy was not one of brilliance on the battlefield, but of persistence and control. Rather than rely on the crumbling Qing army, he began raising his own force, the Xiang army, from his home province. He handpicked officers, trained men with discipline rooted in Confucian loyalty, and emphasized personal responsibility and morality as much as military efficiency. To many, it was unconventional. To others, dangerous. But it worked. City by city, river by river, his army advanced, methodically tightening the noose around the Taiping. And yet, Zheng Guofan was never at peace with what he had to do. The price of principle, though a general, Zheng never ceased to be a scholar, and his letters, private, melancholic, and painfully honest, reveal a man haunted by his own choices. He once wrote, "The suppression of rebellion is necessary, but it soils the soul. I have sent men to their deaths. I have razed cities that once housed scholars and children. In preserving the empire, I may have destroyed its humanity." He carried out executions, sieges, and mass killings, all in the name of restoring order. But unlike many warlords, Zheng did not glory in it. In fact, it crushed him. Broken Heart Nanjing and the final blow by 1864, the Xiong army stood outside Nanjing, the city that had been the Taiping capital for over a decade. Inside, starvation reigned. Cannibalism was whispered of. Hong Xiuquan was already dead by poison or suicide. What remained was a city of ghosts and embers. When Zheng's forces finally broke through, they unleashed a fury unmatched even in a war of horrors. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. The heavenly capital became a graveyard, and Zheng Guofan, victor of the rebellion, stood amidst the ashes, not in triumph, but in mourning. He ordered strict burial rites for the fallen. He banned his men from desecrating the corpses of Taiping leaders, and then he withdrew quietly from public celebration. Classical, the philosopher general, to many historians, Zheng remains one of the most complex figures in Chinese history. He upheld the Qing not out of love for emperors, but out of belief in order over chaos, virtue over anarchy. He saw the Taiping not just as rebels, but as a threat to the very moral fabric of Chinese civilization. And yet, he admired their courage. He respected their resolve. In his journals, he reflected, had their cause been less fevered, had their vision been rooted in righteousness rather than delusion, perhaps China would have been changed by them and not destroyed. He was not blind to nuance. He was simply committed to a different kind of heaven, not one promised in visions, but one forged in duty, tradition, and sacrifice. Candle Legacy and Lament. Zheng Guofan died in 1872. 8 years after the fall of Nanjing, he was honored with titles, praised for saving the dynasty. But to this day, his legacy is divided. To Confucians, he is a hero, a man who upheld ancient virtue in a time of madness. To revolutionaries, he is a traitor to progress, a killer of dreams. And to ordinary people, he is simply the man who ended the war, for better or worse. In truth, he may be all these things at once. His life forces us to confront a question that history never answers easily. Can one do terrible things and still be good? The Taiping Rebellion had ended. After 14 years of chaos, slaughter, and fire, the dust began to settle across China's scorched heartland. The banners of rebellion were torn down, the heavenly kingdom collapsed, and the imperial yellow once again fluttered above the ruins of Nanjing. But peace does not always mean strength, and though the Qing Dynasty had survived, the empire that emerged from the ashes was not the same as the one that had stood before. Let's walk now through the post-war empire, a court licking its wounds, a people learning to live with loss, and a dynasty wondering if its reprieve from collapse was only temporary, waxing crescent moon victory without triumph. The fall of the Taiping was heralded by the Qing court as a great restoration. Edicts were issued in celebration. Honors were distributed to generals like Zheng Guofan, Zhuo Zongtang, and Li Hongzheng. But beneath the ceremonies, a quiet truth settled in. The Qing had not truly won. The rebellion had exposed every flaw in the imperial system, from military weakness to bureaucratic decay, from disconnected emperors to the suffering of peasants. Yes, the throne was intact, but the aura of invincibility, that divine mandate that once cloaked the emperor like armor, had been pierced, and the people had seen it bleed. A wounded land, the physical toll was staggering. Over 20 million lives were lost during the rebellion, a number so vast it defies comprehension. Some provinces lost up to half their populations. Entire villages vanished. Farmlands were abandoned. Infrastructure, bridges, roads, canals, lay in ruin. Famine followed. Disease spread. And trauma settled in the hearts of survivors like dust in a ruined temple. The Qing court sent officials to assess the damage. In one devastated region, a magistrate wrote, "Not a crow cries, not a dog barks. The fields grow wild, for there are no hands left to tend them." It would take generations to recover, but would the dynasty live long enough to see that recovery? Brain a call for reform in the years that followed the rebellion. A growing number of Qing officials, including Zheng Guofan and his proteges, began to advocate for self-strengthening. They believed that if the empire was to survive the modern world, it would need more than Confucian virtue. It would need modern weaponry, Western knowledge, industrial capacity, reformed bureaucracy. This led to the self-strengthening movement, a campaign that sought to blend Western science with Chinese ethics. Arsenals were built, shipyards modernized, schools for foreign languages opened, but reform was slow, and resistance was deep. Many conservative officials feared that opening the empire to Western ideas would erode Chinese culture, just as the Taiping had tried to replace it. And above all, there was one woman who held the keys to China's future, and whose influence would both shape and haunt the dynasty's final years. Dragon the shadow of Empress Dowager Cixi, with the death of the Xianfeng Emperor in 1861, power fell into the hands of a formidable figure, Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi, once a low-ranking concubine, had risen through the inner court with remarkable cunning. As regent to her young son, the Tongzhai Emperor, she became the true ruler behind the throne. She supported reform when it suited her. She encouraged modernization, so long as it didn't threaten the court's control. To her supporters, she was a protector of stability. To her critics, she was the last great obstacle to genuine transformation. But one thing is clear: nothing in the post-Taiping Qing court happened without her consent. Fire, the lingering fear, despite the rebellion's end. Fear lingered like smoke. Secret societies continued to thrive in the countryside. Ethnic tensions simmered. The Muslim uprisings in the northwest flared. The Qing Rebellion, another peasant revolt, surged in the northeast. It was as if the empire, already cracked by the Taiping, could not seal its wounds. Some peasants even whispered that Hong Xiuquan's spirit would rise again, or that a new heaven would be born to finish what he started. And deep inside the court, ministers wondered if the dynasty had only bought time, not salvation. Amphora, the unspoken truth, the truth, though few dared say it aloud, was this: the Qing Dynasty had passed its prime. It had been forced to rely on provincial armies like Zheng Guofan's rather than the imperial banner. A decentralization that would later empower regional warlords and divide the nation further. Its people had learned that the mandate of heaven could be challenged, not just by foreigners, but by fellow Chinese. Its scholars had begun to ask, what is China's place in a world of steamships and rifles? The foundations of the old empire were cracking, slowly, silently. Sunrise over mountains, a fragile dawn. And yet, in the midst of this uncertainty, there was also a quiet sense of possibility. Could the empire reinvent itself? Could the trauma of the Taiping lead to rebirth? Could Confucian values adapt to the industrial age? These were the questions that would define China's final imperial decades. And though the dynasty stood tall on the surface, its shadow was growing longer. Because sometimes what looks like peace is simply the pause before the next storm. In the hush that followed the Taiping Rebellion, China seemed to exhale, a wounded, ancient empire catching its breath. But rest is not always peace. Even as the ashes cooled, new fires began to smolder beneath the surface. A generation born into ruins looked upon the shattered world around them and wondered, is this the China we must inherit? And in the echo of Hong Xiuquan's dream, others began to imagine their own. Books the youth awaken by the 1870s and 1880s. A shift was taking place, quiet but unmistakable. The young were reading. They were questioning. They were watching the West and Japan with sharpened minds and open eyes. The self-strengthening movement had opened small cracks in the old Confucian walls. Within those cracks, new ideas took root. Nationalism, republicanism, industrialization, liberty. Chinese students sent abroad returned with stories of parliaments, railroads, electricity, and civil rights. They whispered about constitutional monarchy, about ending corruption, about breaking free from the chains of foreign domination. But above all, they began to believe that China could be reborn, not by emperors, but by its people. The reform that faltered. 1898, the 1890s were a decade of humiliations. Japan's crushing victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894, 1895, shocked the Qing court. That that a small island nation, once seen as a younger sibling, could defeat the Middle Kingdom was unthinkable, and it shattered the illusion that traditional China could survive the modern age unchanged. In response, two men rose to push bold reform. The Guangxu Emperor, young and idealistic, and Kang Yaowei, a Confucian scholar turned visionary together. They launched the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping attempt to remake China's education, military, economy, and governance. New ministries were proposed, old customs challenged. The press was encouraged, modern universities envisioned. It was, for a moment, as if a new dawn was breaking over the forbidden city. But power, once again, had other plans. Dragon Cixi strikes again. Empress Dowager Cixi, ever watchful, viewed the reformers with suspicion, and more importantly, resentment. She had not endured the chaos of the Taiping only to see the court undermined by scholars and students. And so, in a silent coup, she overthrew her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, placed him under house arrest, and executed or exiled the reformers. The 100 days ended not with a transformation, but with a shuttered dream, and yet the dream would not die. Crossed the Boxer Rebellion, fury without focus at the turn of the century. Discontent found a new vessel, the Boxer Rebellion. This time, it wasn't scholars or soldiers leading the charge, but secret societies, mystics, and rural fighters. The Boxers were anti-foreign, anti-Christian, and convinced they could resist bullets with spiritual rituals. Their slogan was, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreign." A strange alliance, a grassroots uprising that paradoxically pledged loyalty to the very dynasty it threatened to destabilize. Cixi, desperate to channel their rage, endorsed them. But the result was catastrophe. An international alliance, 8 powerful nations, invaded China, sacked Beijing, and imposed massive reparations. Once again, the empire survived on paper, but spiritually, it fractured further. Firecracker enter the revolutionaries, while the Boxers burned churches and shrines. A different kind of revolutionary was emerging. Educated, strategic, patient. Their leader was a man named Sun Yat-sen, a former physician who would become known as the father of modern China. Sun saw the Taiping Rebellion not as an aberration, but as an unfinished chapter, a call for systemic change that had been silenced by force, but never answered. He envisioned a republic built on nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. His message spread through pamphlets, speeches, and underground networks. Where Hong Xiuquan had claimed divine authority, Sun Yat-sen called for popular sovereignty, and where the Taiping had isolated themselves in heavenly visions, the revolutionaries built bridges with students, merchants, military men, and overseas Chinese. It was a quieter movement, but it was building, candle a shadow that would not fade in many ways. The ghost of the Taiping Rebellion haunted every corridor of this new era. Hong Xiuquan's blend of Chinese identity and foreign religion sparked later debates on cultural purity. His dream of equality, however flawed, inspired later ideals of land reform and social justice. His destruction of Confucian orthodoxy challenged the foundation of Chinese thought, opening space for new ideologies to emerge. And perhaps most importantly, the sheer scale of the rebellion had shown that mass movements could shake empires. Every revolutionary who picked up a pen or a rifle in the early 20th century carried, knowingly or not, the echoes of Nanjing. Milky Way the quiet before the fall. As the Qing staggered into its final decade, it resembled a hollowed tree, tall, majestic, but rotting from within. The dynasty still bore the dragon seal, still held ceremonies in the Forbidden City, but outside its walls, revolution was whispering in the wind, in tea houses, in universities, in army barracks, in distant provinces. The people were no longer waiting for emperors or heavenly kings. They were preparing to rise on their own. By the time the calendar turned to the year 1911, the Qing Dynasty was living on borrowed time. Its emperors still occupied the throne, but the throne itself had grown fragile, a relic of past centuries, polished on the outside, but hollow within. The people, once quiet and obedient, were stirring. The gentry, once loyal, were questioning. The soldiers, once fierce protectors of the dragon throne, were quietly preparing their weapons for something new, something inevitable. Mantelpiece, a dynasty, drifting. The Empress Dowager Cixi had died in 1908, and with her, much of the dynasty's iron control slipped into history. In her place, the throne passed to a boy Puyi, just 2 years old. They called him the Xuantong Emperor. He was crowned amidst ancient rituals, dressed in robes centuries old, and placed on a throne that now seemed far too large for him. In every sense, behind him stood regents, bureaucrats, eunuchs, all struggling to hold together a system that had already begun to unravel. The imperial court still clung to the grand theater of tradition, but outside the Forbidden City walls, a different play was unfolding. Firecracker, the fuse is lit. Wucheng uprising in October of 1911. A small explosion shook the city of Wucheng in Hubei province. At first, it seemed like just another military disturbance, perhaps another mutiny. But this was not chaos. It was revolution. The Wucheng uprising, led by disillusioned soldiers who had secretly pledged allegiance to the revolutionary cause, marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty. They captured the city with stunning speed. Word spread like fire. In days, provinces across China declared independence from the Qing court, not just peasants or rebels this time, but governors, generals, and civil officials. The structure of empire began to crack, not from the outside, but from within. World provinces fall like dominoes from Hunan to Yunnan, from Shanxi to Shandong. A chorus of declarations arose. We are no longer loyal to the Qing. Each province falling felt like a page being torn from a centuries-old manuscript. But the revolution was not fueled by rage alone. It was organized, guided by ideas that had matured since the failure of the Taiping. Ideas planted by men like Sun Yat-sen, who had spent years abroad gathering support, funding, and philosophy. His vision was not merely to tear down the old, but to build something new. Bust in silhouette enters Sun Yat-sen at the time of the Wuchang uprising. Sun Yat-sen was far from China, in Denver, Colorado, of all places, speaking to overseas Chinese about the hope of a new republic. When he received news of the revolution, he moved swiftly, returning to Asia to take part in the moment he had worked his whole life to create. By December of 1911, Sun Yat-sen arrived in Nanjing, the very city that had once been the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. There, in a hall that echoed with history, he was elected provisional president of the Republic of China. He took no crown. He invoked no divine right. Instead, he called upon the people, all of them, to forge a modern nation, a China ruled not by one family, but by all its sons and daughters. Performing arts the abdication of Puyi in early 1912. As revolutionary momentum surged, the Qing court finally bowed to the inevitable. The last emperor, little Puyi, just 6 years old, was made to abdicate. It was not a dramatic moment, no executions, no sieges. Rather, it was done with ink, parchment, and resignation. On February 12, 1912, the Qing Dynasty ended. 2,000 years of imperial rule dissolved with a pen stroke. Puyi remained in the Forbidden City, allowed to keep his title, his staff, and his isolated world for a time, but he would never again rule China. Dove the Republic is born. The Republic of China was declared. For the first time in recorded history, China was no longer ruled by an emperor. The air felt different, filled with uncertainty, yes, but also hope. From peasant to poet, from merchant to soldier, the idea of citizenship began to take root. But with the fall of the Qing, a question hung over the Republic like a distant storm. Could a nation that had never known democracy truly embrace it? Sun Yat-sen believed it could, but even he knew that China's journey had only just begun. Echoes of the past, the fall of the Qing, was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the final chord in a symphony that had begun decades earlier, with the fires of the Taiping Rebellion. The idea that a government could be overthrown by its people, that traditions could be challenged, that China could be remade. These seeds were first sown in the bloodied fields of the 1850s. And now, in 1912, they bloomed not with a roar, but with a quiet, determined breath. But revolution is never an endpoint. It is always a beginning. When we speak of history, we often look for clear endings. A battle won, a dynasty overthrown, a flag raised in triumph. But some stories do not end, they echo. The Taiping Rebellion, though crushed by sword and flame, was never truly silenced. Its tremors lingered in the soil of China's transformation. Its memory haunted emperors, inspired radicals, and whispered through the halls of power for generations. Let us now step back and look not only at what was destroyed, but what was born from the ashes. Fire a revolution before its time in many ways. The Taiping Rebellion was too early. The world was not yet ready for the ideas it carried of land redistribution, gender equality, and the fusion of religious zeal with political revolution. Had it emerged 50 years later, during the age of global republicanism, it might have found different allies, different outcomes. But in the mid-19th century, it was viewed with suspicion by foreign powers, by Confucian elites, by the cautious population. It challenged too much, too fast. Still, it planted the seed. Sun Yat-sen later studied the Taiping's model closely. Even Mao Zedong would describe it as a peasant revolution that inspired his own movement. They saw in Hong Xiuquan's failed dream the prototype of revolution and its tragic lessons. Droplet, the human cost, a cautionary tale. Yet, inspiration must not blind us to devastation. Let us not forget that the Taiping Rebellion left over 20 million dead, the vast majority civilians. Towns were wiped off the map. Rivers ran red. Orchards burned. Libraries lost. Entire families erased. The Yellow River, once a lifeline, became a graveyard. Children grew up without parents. Parents buried children by the thousands. The rebellion was not just a war. It was a collapse of order, a rupture in the soul of a nation. And in that sense, the Taiping was not only a dream, it was a nightmare. A reminder that even the most righteous ideas, if wielded with fanaticism, can become instruments of horror. Dove Hong Xiuquan Messiah, or Madman, the figure of Hong Xiuquan remains an enigma. To some, he was a deluded soul, a failed scholar who mistook fever dreams for prophecy. To others, he was a visionary, daring to dream beyond tradition, standing against the crushing weight of an empire and its corruption. Was he the son of God, as he claimed? History doesn't answer that question. But what it does show is this: Hong Xiuquan dared to believe that the heavens could be brought to earth. And though his vision failed, it forced an empire to look at itself. Books reform through fire, ironically. It was the failure of the Taiping that pushed the Qing into reform. The devastation had revealed just how brittle their control was and how deeply the people had suffered. They restructured their military. They modernized railroads, arsenals, and industry. They sent students abroad to learn from the West. Even the deeply traditional examination system, the heart of Chinese bureaucracy for centuries, would eventually be abolished. Would the Qing have made these changes without the Taiping firestorm? Perhaps, but certainly not as urgently. Reform, in this case, was not born of wisdom, but of survival. Globe showing Asia, Australia, foreign powers, and the balance of empires the West, too, took note. Britain, France, the United States, they watched the rebellion closely. Initially unsure of who to support, they eventually sided with the Qing, not because of loyalty, but because the Taiping's version of Christianity was troubling. To them, Hong Xiuquan was a heretic, and more importantly, a destabilizing force in a region critical to trade and influence. The Taiping Rebellion taught foreign powers that China was not immovable, that change could come swiftly, violently, and unpredictably. It reshaped how they dealt with the empire, with more force, more fear, and more control. The unequal treaties grew harsher, the stakes higher. Memory in the Chinese mind today. Few outside China know the full scale of the Taiping Rebellion. It is not taught in every textbook. It is rarely the subject of global films or literature. But within China, it remains a solemn memory. In museums, the tattered banners of the heavenly kingdom are still preserved. In Jiangnan, there are villages that never rebuilt after the fires. And in Nanjing, the stones remember. For the Chinese people, the Taiping was not just a war, it was a reckoning, a time when everything was questioned. Heaven, empire, family, tradition. Its shadow lingers in the collective memory like a haunting lullaby. Compass what remains. So, what do we carry from this journey? We've walked through palaces and burning fields. We've seen emperors and peasants, prophets and soldiers. We've watched heaven rise and hell follow behind it. And in the quiet aftermath, perhaps we understand something deeper, that history is never just the past. It is a mirror. The Taiping Rebellion reflects how fragile civilization can be and how powerful belief can become when wedded to desperation. It teaches us that utopia is not built by force, that heaven cannot be carved from suffering, and yet the courage to imagine a better world, even in flawed form, that remains noble, even holy. Crescent moon, one last thought before you sleep. As you lay your head down tonight, consider this. Not long ago, across the seas and mountains, there were men and women who believed they could change the world with nothing but faith, fire, and a dream. They failed, but in their failure, they shook the oldest empire on earth. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. The courage to dream, even when the world is not ready. Thank you for being with me on this journey through the long night of history. If you're still awake, tell me, from where are you listening? What time is it for you right now? Leave me a comment below. And if this helped you fall asleep or dream a little deeper, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll explore more hidden corners of time together. Until next time, good night. Sherry.